In this video, we're going to be breaking down every time you felt bad for Peter Griffin. Let's get started. Peter's plastic surgery addiction. When vanity nearly destroyed the Griffin family, Peter Griffin becomes completely obsessed with plastic surgery after getting liposuction, transforming himself into someone unrecognizable and losing his family's love in the process.
Peter, you can't just suck 200 pounds of fat out of yourself. It's not natural.
This episode shows how quickly vanity can spiral out of control when someone gets their first taste of being conventionally attractive. The whole mess starts because Chris feels terrible about his weight and wants to go swimming at the hotel pool without his shirt. The family is staying at a hotel because their house got infested with fleas, and what should have been a fun vacation turns into another painful reminder for Chris about his body image.
Chris, why don't you want to take your shirt off?
'Cause I'm fat.
Peter watches his son struggle with these issues and genuinely wants to help. He takes Chris to see Lois's brother Broderick, who's a cosmetic surgeon, thinking that a quick fix will solve everything. Broderick gives this bizarre explanation about how he sneaks around inside you, like a Green Beret in Vietnam, to get all the fat out, which should have been warning sign number one that this guy might not be the most professional doctor. When Chris makes the surprisingly mature decision to stick with diet and exercise instead of surgery, you'd think that would be the end of it. But Peter, being Peter, decides to get the procedure done on himself anyway. He removes a massive 200 pounds of fat in one go, which is absolutely insane from a medical standpoint. Most legitimate doctors would never do something that extreme because it's incredibly dangerous. But Broderick apparently has no problem turning Peter into a completely different person overnight. Once Peter sees how dramatically different he looks, everything changes. He becomes addicted to the attention and the way people suddenly treat him like royalty. Strangers start doing favors for him. Doors literally open wherever he goes, and he gets invited to join this exclusive, beautiful people's club. The club gives him a welcome basket with Ferrari sunglasses and pills to make his bowel movements smell like cinnamon rolls, which is both ridiculous and somehow perfectly captures how obsessed these people are with every aspect of their appearance. But Peter doesn't stop there. He becomes convinced that he needs even more work done. He gets completely new buttocks because his old one had a crack in it, which is such a Peter Griffin way to justify unnecessary surgery. He keeps going back to Broderick for more procedures, each one making him look less and less like the Peter his family knew. The doctor apparently has no ethical boundaries and just keeps operating on him whenever Peter asks. The surgery addiction completely changes Peter's personality in the worst possible ways.
Oh, I hate what you've become. Why don't you go back to that doctor and have him suck the fat out of your head?
Maybe I will.
He becomes this shallow, narcissistic person who looks down on everyone else, including his own family. He starts calling regular people normies, like he's some kind of superior being. When Lois tries to talk to him about how he's treating Chris, Peter acts like she's jealous and beneath him now. He even pastes his new face over Lois's face in their wedding photo because he thinks his new look is so much better than anything else in the picture. The most heartbreaking moment happens when Peter tries to bring Chris to the beautiful people's club. The bouncer takes one look at Chris and tells him he can't come in because he's fat. This is exactly the kind of rejection that's been making Chris feel terrible about himself. And instead of defending his son or walking away, Peter just abandons Chris at the door and goes inside anyway. He chooses his new shallow friends over his own kid, which shows just how far he's fallen. Lois calls him out for becoming a superficial, egomaniacal jerk, but even she admits she's never been more attracted to him physically. This creates this weird situation where she's disgusted by his personality but drawn to his appearance, which really shows how messed up society's beauty standards can be. Even when people know someone has become horrible, they still get caught up in how attractive they look. Peter's vanity spiral reaches its absolute peak when he decides to get facial surgery too. By this point, he's so obsessed with perfection that he can't stop himself from going under the knife again. But this time, the operation goes horribly wrong and nearly kills him. The transcript mentions that it's a miracle he's alive at all, and that medical science has come just so far, which suggests that all his surgeries combined created some kind of medical disaster. When the bandages finally come off, all his surgeries have somehow been undone, and he looks exactly like his old self again. His family is genuinely relieved to have the real Peter back, which says everything about how much they miss the person he used to be. Even though he was overweight and had flaws, they loved him for who he actually was, not for some artificial version created by a surgeon. This storyline hits hard because Peter's transformation affects everyone around him in different ways. Chris already felt insecure about his weight, and seeing his dad prioritize appearance over family relationships probably made those feelings even worse. The kid was trying to do the right thing by exercising and eating better, but then he has to watch his father choose vanity over being a supportive parent. Lois struggles with being attracted to Peter's new look while hating what he's become as a person, which puts her in an impossible position. She knows he's become someone terrible, but she can't control her physical reaction to his appearance. This shows how beauty standards can mess with people's heads, even when they know better. The episode ends with Peter admitting he didn't actually learn anything from the experience, which is both frustrating and somehow perfectly honest. Sometimes people go through traumatic experiences and come out the other side without really growing or changing. The fact that Peter acknowledges this makes the whole storyline feel more real, even though the circumstances are completely ridiculous. This episode demonstrates how plastic surgery addiction can destroy relationships and turn someone into a completely different person who cares more about superficial beauty than the people who actually matter. Peter nearly died and lost his family's respect, all because he couldn't handle being ordinary looking. Peter's nickel-eating disaster, how a desperate stunt left him blind and helpless.
Peter, you're really putting away those Mentos.
Oh, these aren't Mentos, Lois. Everybody, you're looking at a guy who's gonna set a new world record. I am gonna eat more nickels than anyone has ever eaten before. Setting this world record is gonna make me famous, just like the world's fattest twins over there.
Peter Griffin decides to eat dozens of nickels to set a world record and become famous. But the stunt backfires catastrophically when he develops nickel poisoning and loses his sight completely. This episode shows how far Peter will go for attention and recognition, even when the consequences are life-changing. Peter's obsession with being remembered starts during a night out with his friends at the bowling alley. He watches Mort bowl a perfect game and gets celebrated for it, sees Quagmire receive a key to the city for accidentally saving someone's life through CPR, and listens to Joe brag about his collection of medals for heroism. Even Cleveland gets recognition for his past career as an accomplished auctioneer. Peter realizes he's the only one in the group who has never done anything memorable or noteworthy. This hits him hard, because he's always been someone who craves attention and validation. The feeling of being ordinary and forgettable really gets to Peter. He tries several different schemes to make a name for himself, including building a flying machine that predictably crashes and creating an environmental character called Gary the No-Trash Cougar, who aggressively tells people to pick up their garbage. None of these attempts work out the way he hopes. When Brian suggests he try to break a world record, Peter gets excited about the possibility. While eating dinner, he notices himself consuming a bunch of nickels that were apparently mixed in with his food, and that's when the idea hits him. Peter becomes convinced that eating more nickels than anyone in history will be his ticket to fame and recognition. He starts downing handfuls of coins, like they're candy, completely ignoring any potential health risks. His family watches in horror as he continues this bizarre eating challenge, but Peter is determined to push through and achieve his goal. He's so focused on breaking the record that he doesn't consider what swallowing that much metal might do to his body. The whole thing becomes this weird spectacle where Peter treats dangerous behavior like a fun game. The nickel eating plan goes horribly wrong when Peter wakes up the next morning and realizes he can't see anything. The doctor explains that ingesting such a large number of metal coins has given him nickel poisoning, which has caused him to lose his sight completely. Peter goes from being this confident guy trying to make a name for himself to someone who suddenly can't perform basic tasks anymore. He can't drive, doesn't know when to cross streets safely, and even accidentally uses a church confessional as a bathroom because he gets disoriented about where he is. Peter's immediate reaction to going blind is pure devastation. He tells Brian that now the only thing people will remember him for is being that blind guy, which is the exact opposite of what he wanted to achieve. The family has to completely reorganize their lives around Peter's disability. Lois starts looking into support groups and feels like she doesn't need to worry about her appearance anymore, since Peter can't see her. The kids have to help with things Peter used to handle himself. He gets a seeing eye dog named Brutus, but even that doesn't make him feel independent again. The blindness completely changes Peter's relationship with the world around him. Simple activities like going to the bar become complicated and dangerous. When a fire breaks out at the Drunken Clam while Peter is there, he accidentally becomes a hero by unknowingly helping Horace escape the burning building. The news covers his heroic actions, and Peter finally gets the recognition he wanted, but under completely different circumstances than he planned. He ends up being remembered for something positive, but only because his disability put him in a situation where he stumbled into doing the right thing. This storyline demonstrates how Peter's desperate need for attention and fame led him to make incredibly poor decisions that had permanent consequences. The nickel-eating stunt represents everything wrong with Peter's approach to problem solving. He chooses the most extreme and dangerous option without thinking through the potential results. His blindness becomes a harsh lesson about how reckless behavior can completely change someone's life in ways they never expected. Peter wanted to be special and memorable, but he ended up becoming dependent on others and losing his independence instead. Peter's lowest point. When even Brian's peanut butter jelly dance can't help. Peter Griffin hits rock bottom emotionally after destroying his relationship with baby Stewie, and even Brian's famous peanut butter jelly dance fails to cheer him up for the first time ever.
Hey, I know what'll cheer you up.
Nah, I don't think I'm in the mood.
Are you sure? It's peanut butter jelly time, peanut butter jelly time, peanut butter jelly time.
This moment shows just how deeply Peter's parenting failures have affected him, marking one of the rare times we see genuine emotional weight in the show. The whole mess starts when Lois tells Peter he needs to spend more quality time with Stewie because the baby has been acting out at daycare. Peter's initial attempts at bonding are selfish and misguided. He takes Stewie to places like strip clubs and baseball games that are completely inappropriate for a baby. When those don't work, Peter discovers that Stewie laughs hysterically when Peter throws food at Lois. This becomes their new bonding activity, with Peter pelting Lois with rice, beans, and other groceries, while Stewie cracks up watching his mother get hurt. Peter becomes obsessed with making Stewie laugh and thinks he's finally cracked the code of good parenting. He starts treating Lois like a human target, throwing food at her whenever Stewie is around because it gets such a strong reaction. Peter genuinely believes this violent behavior counts as quality father-son time since Stewie finds it so entertaining. The situation escalates when Lois tries to discipline Stewie for his bad behavior, and Peter actually sides with the baby against his own wife. This creates a toxic dynamic where Peter encourages Stewie's disrespect toward Lois just to maintain their connection. Everything falls apart when Lois finally puts her foot down and sends Stewie to his room despite Peter's protests. Stewie feels completely betrayed by Peter's failure to protect him from punishment and turns on his father instantly. The baby calls Peter a spineless oaf and a wuss, telling him to get out of his room. When Peter tries to make amends, Stewie reveals that he even faked enjoying their bonding time together. saying he faked all those bowel movements during their activities. This crushes Peter because he realizes his son never actually cared about spending time with him. Peter becomes genuinely depressed after losing Stewie's affection. When Brian tries to cheer him up with the peanut butter jelly dance, something that has apparently worked countless times before, Peter just sits there completely unresponsive. Brian asks if he wants to see the dance, and Peter sadly says he doesn't think he's in the mood. Brian tries again, asking if he's sure, but Peter apologizes and says the dance just isn't working for him today. This is a huge moment because the transcript suggests this dance has been Brian's go-to method for lifting Peter's spirits, and now even that reliable source of joy can't touch Peter's sadness. The failed peanut butter jelly dance represents Peter's complete emotional breakdown. He tells Brian he feels awful because he and Stewie were getting along, but now his son hates him. Peter genuinely doesn't understand how to be a good father and asks Brian for advice on how to get Stewie to like him again. This vulnerability is rare for Peter, who usually bounces back from setbacks with his typical oblivious optimism. The fact that his depression is deep enough to resist Brian's silly dance shows how much the rejection from Stewie actually hurt him. This moment reveals something important about Peter's character that often gets overlooked. Despite all his selfish and destructive behavior, he genuinely wants his children to love him and feels real pain when they don't. The peanut butter jelly dance failure becomes a marker of just how low Peter can sink emotionally when his family relationships fall apart. Most of the time, Peter's problems are external, work issues, neighbor disputes, or physical disasters. But when the problem comes from within his own family and involves his fundamental inadequacy as a parent, even his best friend's most reliable comfort can't reach him. The episode shows that underneath all of Peter's buffoonish behavior, there's actually a person who can feel genuine remorse and sadness about hurting the people he loves most. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Peter's sister Karen, how childhood bullying shaped his own cruelty.
And Karen?
And you must be Meg.
Do that to me!
Peter Griffin's abusive sister Karen returns for Thanksgiving, instantly reducing him to a terrified, stuttering child and revealing the painful origins of his own bullying behavior toward his family. This episode shows how childhood trauma can create cycles of abuse that continue into adulthood. The family discovers Peter has a sister when she writes to say she wants to spend Thanksgiving with them after their mother's death. Peter has kept Karen completely secret for years. Even Brian, his best friend, has never heard her mentioned. When Lois announces Karen is coming for dinner, Peter immediately panics and says it's going to be a disaster. His reaction seems over the top until Karen actually arrives and everyone sees why Peter has been hiding her existence. Karen turns out to be Heavy Flo, a professional lady wrestler who's physically intimidating and emotionally brutal. From the moment she walks in, she starts humiliating Peter with childhood nicknames like Pee-Pee and Chin Nuts. She immediately dominates the entire Thanksgiving gathering, telling embarrassing stories about Peter's childhood and making him the butt of every joke. The family finds her hilarious and entertaining, which makes Peter's situation even worse because now his own wife and kids are laughing at his humiliation. The real damage happens during the family football game after dinner. Karen puts Peter in her signature wrestling move called the Toxic Shock, which leaves him gasping for air and stuttering uncontrollably. When Peter tries to protest, saying, "You're a jerk, Karen," his stutter kicks in and he can barely get the words out. The transcript mentions that whenever Peter stutters, he usually wets himself, which shows just how deeply this childhood trauma still affects his body's stress responses. Karen has reduced a grown man to the same helpless state he was in as a kid. Peter becomes completely withdrawn and ashamed after the wrestling incident. Meg notices how badly Karen has been treating her father and finally understands why Peter has been such a bully to her over the years. She tells Peter that she can see Karen as a huge bully and that Peter learned this behavior from being terrorized by his sister. This moment of recognition is crucial because it connects Peter's childhood trauma directly to his parenting failures. The revelation that Peter was bullied explains so much about his character and his relationship with his children, especially Meg. Meg realizes that Peter has been taking out all the pain and powerlessness he felt as a child on her, creating another generation of the same abuse cycle. She tells him that maybe if he finally stands up to Karen, he'll stop taking it out on her for the rest of her life. This shows remarkable insight from Meg, who understands that Peter's cruelty comes from his own unresolved trauma. Peter's decision to challenge Karen to a wrestling match represents his attempt to finally confront decades of abuse and reclaim some dignity. When he dresses up as Maxie Patty and enters the wrestling ring, he's essentially going back to fight the battles he couldn't win as a child. The fact that Meg ends up saving him by hitting Karen with a real chair instead of a fake one shows that Peter still needed protection from his abuser, even as an adult. The episode ends with Peter apologizing to Meg and admitting that he took out all his pain on her because his own parents never protected him from Karen's bullying. This creates a touching moment where both Peter and Meg acknowledge the cycle of abuse and express love for each other, despite it. Peter finally understands that his defensive cruelty toward his children comes from his own childhood wounds, and Meg forgives him because she sees the scared little boy underneath all his aggressive behavior. This storyline demonstrates how childhood bullying can have lasting effects that ripple through entire families. Peter's relationship with Karen explains why he often feels the need to assert dominance through humpher and aggression, and gay. He learned early that being vulnerable means getting hurt. The episode suggests that understanding the source of harmful behavior doesn't excuse it, but but it can be the first step toward breaking destructive patterns and healing family relationships. Peter's nightmare: how James Woods stole his entire life.
Oh my God, it's you! James Woods!
Hello, Peter. I've been expecting you.
You stole my credit card, you son of a bitch! What did I ever do to you?
That's a good question, Peter.
James Woods completely destroys Peter Griffin's existence by stealing his identity and taking over his family, leaving Peter homeless and powerless to prove who he really is. This episode shows how devastating identity theft can be when someone with resources and determination decides to systematically ruin another person's life. The whole ordeal starts because Peter locked James Woods in a wooden crate without air holes during a previous encounter. Woods has been nursing this grudge and planning his revenge ever since. When Peter loses his wallet at a Barry Manilow concert, which he and his friends attended ironically, but ended up genuinely enjoying, Woods sees his perfect opportunity for revenge. Woods steals Peter's credit card and starts racking up charges, knowing this will eventually lead Peter right to him. The credit card bill shows thousands of dollars in purchases, including a big screen TV, massage chair, and daily meals at House of Chung restaurant. Woods reveals he's been planning this elaborate revenge scheme to make Peter pay for humiliating him. After Peter and Brian track him down at the restaurant, Woods confronts them with cold calculation. He tells Peter that he humiliated him and put him through hell, and now Peter is going to pay for it. This conversation makes it clear that Woods has been methodically planning every detail of his revenge, studying Peter's life and preparing to take it over completely. The real nightmare begins when Woods somehow manages to steal all of Peter's important documents, USO, his driver's license, social security card, passport, and even the title to his house. Woods doesn't just want to steal Peter's money. He wants to steal Peter's entire existence and make him watch as an imposter takes over his life. The sophistication of this identity theft goes far beyond typical credit card fraud. Woods has essentially become Peter Griffin on paper. Woods shows up at the Griffin house, claiming to be Peter Griffin, and presenting all the paperwork to prove it. When Lois calls the police, even Joe Swanson has to side with Woods, because legally, all the documentation supports his claim to be the real Peter Griffin. Joe apologizes to the real Peter, but explains that legally, he has no choice. The man with the paperwork gets to stay in the house. The scene becomes absolutely humiliating when Joe forces the real Peter to strip down to what Woods mockingly calls his poop sack, leaving Peter naked and homeless while an imposter takes over his life. Peter finds himself living like a stray animal, literally tied to a post outside his own house while Woods moves in and starts playing father to his children. The psychological torture of watching someone else live your life while you're powerless to stop it drives Peter to desperation. Woods completely takes over Peter's role in the family, sitting at his dinner table, sleeping in his bed, and parenting his children. The family starts accepting Woods as their new father figure, which crushes Peter emotionally because he's watching his own children bond with his tormentor. Woods doesn't just steal Peter's identity, he actively corrupts it. He gives Chris inappropriate advice about using drugs to meet women, telling him about his encounters with Kate Moss through their shared cocaine supplier. He encourages Meg's eating disorder by introducing her to bulimia through a character called Mr. Pukey, promoting dangerous weight loss methods to a vulnerable teenager. Woods uses Peter's position as father to harm the children in ways the real Peter, despite his flaws, would never do. The psychological warfare continues as Woods threatens to call the police anytime Peter tries to get near his own house. Peter becomes desperate to see his family and disguises himself as one of Chris's friends named Scooter, complete with an over-the-top innocent persona. But Woods immediately sees through the disguise and kicks him out again, demonstrating that he's always one step ahead. Peter reaches his lowest point when he tells Brian that Woods has won and he'll never get his life back. Brian comes up with the solution of fighting fire with fire. If Woods can steal Peter's identity, then Peter can steal Woods' identity and ruin his reputation. They get Peter fake James Woods' identification, and he starts appearing on television as the famous actor. Peter promotes an offensive 9/11 comedy movie called September 11, 2000 Fun, describing it as real old-style comedy where he plays a window washer who sees the plane coming and says, "Come on!" He adds that the voice of the plane is David Spade, which particularly enrages the real Woods. Peter's impersonation successfully destroys Woods' career and public image. The news reports that James Woods has gone from America's most beloved celebrity to America's most hated pariah almost overnight. This forces Woods to confront Peter in an alley, where he's furious about his ruined reputation. Peter tricks him into following a trail of candy pieces that leads into a wooden crate, using Woods' apparent obsession with sweets against him. The episode demonstrates how identity theft can be far more devastating than just financial fraud. Woods doesn't just steal Peter's money, he steals his family, his home, and his entire sense of self. Peter experiences what amounts to social death. He exists, but has no legal way to prove who he is or reclaim his life. The fact that even his close friend Joe has to follow the law and evict him shows how powerless victims of sophisticated identity theft can become when the system fails them. Woods' revenge succeeds because he understands that the most painful thing you can do to someone like Peter is take away his family. Peter can handle being broke or embarrassed, but watching another man raise his children and sleep in his bed drives him to complete desperation. The episode shows how family identity is just as important as legal identity. and losing both simultaneously creates a special kind of hell that goes beyond mere financial inconvenience. The storyline also reveals how vulnerable our modern identity system really is. When someone has the right paperwork, even close friends and family members have to accept their claims because that's how the legal system works. Peter's situation demonstrates that identity is essentially a collection of documents, and whoever controls those documents controls your entire existence. Woods' methodical approach to destroying Peter's life shows how someone with enough determination and resources can weaponize bureaucracy itself against their victims. Peter's devastating stroke, when gluttony nearly killed him. Peter Griffin suffers a massive stroke after consuming 30 hamburgers in one sitting, leaving the left side of his body completely paralyzed and forcing his family to watch him struggle with basic daily activities. This episode shows how Peter's extreme eating habits finally catch up with him in the most serious way possible, turning his usual comedic gluttony into a genuine medical crisis. The disaster begins when Peter loses his beloved mustache in a fire while heroically saving someone from a burning McBurgertown restaurant. The mustache had become central to Peter's identity and self-worth, and stire. He joined what he called a very special community of mustache-wearing men who looked out for each other. Losing it devastates Peter emotionally, and he becomes desperate to fill the void left by this loss. When Todd Myers, the man Peter rescued, offers him a lifetime supply of free McBurgertown burgers as gratitude, Peter sees it as the perfect way to cope with his grief. Peter starts using the free burgers as emotional medication, telling Brian that eating relieves the pain of mustachelessness. He approaches this binge eating with the same obsessive intensity he brought to growing his mustache, treating food as a drug to numb his psychological pain. Brian tries to warn him after he's already consumed around 30 hamburgers, telling him he should slow down, but Peter dismisses the concern and keeps eating compulsively. The stroke hits Peter suddenly and without warning. He tells Brian that the eating is working because he no longer feels the pain, but then adds ominously that he can't really feel anything on the left half of my body. When Brian asks if he's winking, they realize something is seriously wrong. The medical emergency unfolds quickly. Someone calls an ambulance, and Peter ends up in the hospital, where doctors deliver the devastating news that he's had a stroke and the left side of his body is completely paralyzed. The immediate aftermath shows Peter struggling with the most basic aspects of daily life. When Lois tries to hand him a beer, he angrily corrects her for bringing it to his stroke arm instead of his good arm, showing how the disability has affected even simple pleasures. The family has to adjust to caring for someone who can no longer function independently. 3 months after the stroke, Chris asks when his father will get better, and Lois has to explain that recovery from a stroke can take a very long time. Peter's personality changes dramatically as he becomes bitter and demanding. He yells at Lois to bring him beer and gets frustrated when she doesn't accommodate his disability properly. The stroke has robbed him of his independence and dignity, turning him from the family's boisterous patriarch into someone who needs constant care and assistance. His speech patterns change too. He tells Lois he's had better days when she asks how he feels, showing a defeated attitude that's very different from his usual optimism. The stroke also affects Peter's relationship with his children and friends. He can no longer participate in activities the way he used to, and his physical limitations make him dependent on others for basic needs. The episode shows him struggling to get into a car, highlighting how his mobility has been severely compromised. This medical crisis transforms Peter from someone who lived life without considering consequences into someone who must confront the reality of permanent disability. The episode demonstrates how quickly excessive consumption can lead to serious health consequences. Peter's binge eating of 30 hamburgers in one sitting represents an extreme form of gluttony that crosses the line from comedic overeating into genuinely dangerous behavior. The stroke serves as a harsh reality check about the physical limits of the human body and the real health risks associated with extreme eating habits. Peter eventually gets experimental stem cell treatment that restores his abilities, but the experience leaves a lasting impact. He tries to sue McBurgertown for causing his stroke, though Brian points out that eating 30 hamburgers was Peter's own choice. This highlights the complex relationship between personal responsibility and corporate influence in health problems related to fast food consumption. The storyline shows how Peter's usual pattern of excessive behavior finally caught up with him in a way that couldn't be easily reversed or laughed off. Unlike his other mishaps, the stroke created real, long-term consequences that affected his entire family's quality of life. The episode serves as a sobering reminder that behind Family Guy's cartoon violence and absurd situations, there are real human costs to reckless behavior, and that some choices can have permanent, life-altering consequences that extend far beyond the person making them. Peter's humiliating defeat. When standing up to bullies backfires spectacularly, Peter Griffin transforms from protective father into schoolyard bully himself, only to get completely beaten down by his own childhood tormentor in front of his son Chris. This episode shows how Peter's attempts to teach Chris about standing up to bullies spiral into a humiliating personal defeat that forces both father and son to confront the real meaning of courage. The crisis begins when Chris loses his paper route customers to a new kid named Kyle, who's been aggressively stealing his business. When Chris tries to stand up for himself and ask for his customer back, Kyle beats him up, leaving Chris bruised and defeated. Peter sees his son's injuries and immediately thinks back to his own childhood experiences with Randy Fulcher, a bully who used to pants him in front of other kids. Peter decides he needs to teach Kyle a lesson about picking on his son. Peter goes to Kyle's house, intending to have a reasonable conversation with the boy about bullying Chris. But when Kyle starts mocking Peter, by repeating everything he says in a sarcastic voice and calling him names like big, fat, dumb buttface and dorky, fat numbnuts. Peter snaps. The 43-year-old man completely loses control and beats up a 13-year-old child, crossing a line that transforms him from concerned parent into something much worse. The assault on Kyle awakens something dark in Peter that he can't control. After getting a taste of being the aggressor instead of the victim, Peter becomes addicted to the feeling of power that comes with bullying others. He starts tormenting everyone around him, including his own family members. Peter forces Chris to endure Peter's farts as a form of torture, physically manhandles Joe Swanson by picking him up and demanding he sing songs, and even threatens Lois when she tries to intervene. Peter's bullying behavior escalates to the point where he's terrorizing his entire family and friend group. He explains his twisted philosophy to Chris, saying there are only two kinds of people in the world, bullies and nerds, and he's chosen to be a bully. When Lois confronts him about his behavior, Peter actually starts using physical force against her, making her punch herself while claiming she's doing it to herself. The family watches in horror as Peter becomes the very thing he once feared. The situation reaches its breaking point when Lois points out that Peter has become exactly like Randy Fulcher, his childhood bully. This realization shocks Peter into understanding that he needs to confront the real source of his pain rather than taking it out on innocent people. Peter decides to track down Randy Fulcher and finally settle their childhood score, bringing Chris along to witness what he thinks will be a triumphant moment of standing up to bullies. When Peter finally confronts Randy Fulcher after all these years, the encounter goes horribly wrong. Peter arrives ready for a fight, telling Randy he's going to kick his ass, and then have Chris beat him up too, calling it an old-fashioned father-son beat-off. But Randy reveals that he now has multiple sclerosis, a debilitating neurological condition. Peter, completely missing the medical significance, thinks Randy is bragging about having a monkey scrotum and becomes even more aggressive. Just as Peter is about to attack a disabled man, Chris steps in and physically stops his father. In a moment of profound role reversal, Chris becomes the one standing up to a bully, and that bully is his own father. Chris tells Peter to stop bullying people, demonstrating the very courage and moral clarity that Peter had been trying to teach him all along. The son becomes the teacher, showing his father what real strength looks like. Peter's humiliation is complete when he realizes that his son had to save him from becoming a monster. The man who started this journey trying to protect Chris from bullies ended up becoming the biggest bully in his son's life. Chris's intervention forces Peter to confront the ugly truth about what he's become and how his cycle of violence and revenge has poisoned his relationships with everyone he loves. The episode demonstrates how trauma from childhood bullying can create lifelong patterns of either victimization or aggression. Peter's experience with Randy Fulcher shaped his entire worldview about power and weakness, leading him to believe that people are either predators or prey. When he finally got a taste of being the predator, the rush of power corrupted him completely, turning him into the very thing that had traumatized him as a child. Peter's defeat comes not from physical violence, but from moral clarity. Chris's willingness to stand up to his own father represents the kind of courage Peter had been trying to teach all along. The courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult or dangerous. The episode shows that real strength comes from protecting others and standing up for what's right, not from dominating the weak or seeking revenge for past hurts. The storyline reveals how cycles of abuse perpetuate themselves across generations. Peter's childhood trauma with Randy Fulcher created such deep psychological scars that when given the opportunity for power, he immediately began victimizing others. Only his son's intervention broke this cycle, showing Peter that true courage means being willing to confront bullies, even when that bully is yourself. Peter's devastating father revelation: death, abandonment, and Irish disappointment. Peter Griffin accidentally kills his stepfather Francis during Meg's birthday party and discovers through hypnotherapy that his real father is Mickey McFinnigan, an Irish drunk who abandoned his mother decades ago. This episode explores how Peter's lifelong search for paternal love leads him to a biological father who proves just as disappointing as the man who raised him. The tragedy unfolds during what should have been a celebratory moment at Meg's 17th birthday party. Peter has been drinking heavily while dressed as P. Pants, the inebriated hobo clown, trying to entertain the teenagers with increasingly inappropriate antics. When the party guests react poorly to his drunken clown performance, Peter decides to salvage the situation with what he calls his grand unicycle finale. The family watches in horror as Peter crashes through the ceiling on his unicycle, landing directly on top of Francis Griffin. The accident leaves Francis with catastrophic internal injuries, including broken ribs, a busted spleen, and punctured lungs. As the family gathers around his deathbed, Peter desperately seeks some final moment of connection with the man who raised him. Francis has been a cold, judgmental father throughout Peter's life, constantly criticizing and belittling him. Even in his final moments, Francis shows no warmth or forgiveness, calling Peter a fat, stinking drunk as his last words before dying. The devastating deathbed scene pushes Peter into a crisis about his relationship with alcohol and his identity as a father figure. Francis's dying words hit particularly hard because they reflect Peter's own worst fears about himself. The accusation that he's a fat, stinking drunk forces Peter to confront how his drinking affects his family, leading him to make a dramatic vow to quit alcohol completely. However, Peter's attempt at sobriety goes disastrously wrong when he turns to crack cocaine as a substitute, showing his inability to address the underlying issues driving his addictive behavior. Brian intervenes and convinces Peter to see a hypnotherapist to get to the root of his drinking problem. During the hypnotherapy session, Peter experiences a recovered memory that shatters his understanding of his family history. He remembers Francis telling him, "I'm not your father," during what appeared to be a childhood Father's Day celebration. This revelation explains decades of Francis's cold treatment and Peter's desperate need for paternal approval. Peter's mother, Thelma, confirms the devastating truth when he confronts her. She reveals that 40 years earlier, she had a vacation romance in Ireland with a man named Mickey McFinnigan, who is Peter's biological father. Mickey got her pregnant and then disappeared without a trace, leaving her to raise Peter alone until she married Francis. This revelation recontextualizes Peter's entire childhood. Francis wasn't just a cold stepfather. He was a man forced to raise another man's child, which explains his resentment and emotional distance. Determined to finally find the paternal love he's always craved, Peter travels to Ireland to meet Mickey McFinnigan. When he arrives in McSwiggan village, Peter discovers that Mickey is the town drunk, a position that holds honor in Irish culture according to the locals. Peter initially feels hopeful that he's found someone who might understand and accept him, especially given their shared drinking problems. However, Mickey initially rejects Peter's claim to be his son, saying they're nothing alike. This rejection devastates Peter, who realizes he now has two fathers who want nothing to do with him. Mickey only acknowledges Peter as his son after Peter beats him in a drinking contest, proving he has McFinnigan blood by demonstrating his superior alcohol tolerance. Even then, Mickey shows no real remorse for abandoning Peter's mother or any interest in developing a meaningful relationship. The meeting with Mickey reveals the tragic pattern of Peter's life. Abended for, his drinking problem, and need for approval stem directly from having an alcoholic biological father who abandoned him and a stepfather who resented his existence. Mickey's casual dismissal of his abandonment shows Peter that his real father is just as emotionally unavailable as Francis was, despite their shared Irish heritage and drinking abilities. The episode demonstrates how childhood abandonment and rejection can create lifelong patterns of seeking approval through destructive behavior. Peter's alcoholism connects directly to both his biological father's drinking and his desperate attempts to cope with Francis's emotional abuse. Meeting Mickey doesn't provide the healing Peter hoped for. Instead, it shows him that his problems run deeper than just having a cold stepfather. The story reveals how abandonment trauma can be passed down through generations. Mickey's abandonment of Peter's mother created the circumstances that led to Peter being raised by a resentful stepfather, which in turn shaped Peter's own struggles with fatherhood and self-worth. The cycle continues as Peter's drinking affects his own children, showing how unresolved family trauma perpetuates itself across generations. Peter's journey to Ireland ultimately forces him to confront the reality that he can't find validation from fathers who are fundamentally incapable of providing it. Both Francis and Mickey represent different forms of paternal failure, NEA, one through cold resentment, the other through complete abandonment. The episode suggests that Peter's healing must come from breaking these cycles, rather than seeking approval from men who damaged him. Meg's prison transformation, how jail time turned the family punching bag into the alpha. Meg Griffin returns from prison completely transformed from the family's meek victim into a dangerous aggressor who physically dominates Peter and terrorizes the entire household. This episode shows how the prison system can turn even the most harmless person into a hardened criminal who uses violence to solve problems and assert control. The crisis begins when Brian discovers Meg secretly dating Luke, an escaped convict she met through a school pen pal program. When Brian exposes the relationship to her parents, Lois forbids Meg from seeing Luke again. However, Luke breaks out of prison to be with Meg, and she hides him in her bedroom. When Peter accidentally spots Luke and calls the police, both Meg and Luke get arrested, Luke for escaping, and Meg for harboring a fugitive. Meg's time in prison completely rewires her personality and worldview. She learns that survival depends on being the toughest person in any situation, and that showing weakness invites exploitation. The system that was supposed to rehabilitate her instead teaches her that violence is the most effective way to get respect and control others. When she returns home, she brings these prison survival tactics with her. The moment Meg walks through the door, she immediately establishes herself as the new head of household through intimidation and physical dominance. She asks who the biggest, toughest person in the house is. And when Peter tries to claim that distinction, she shuts him down with the declaration, "My house now, bitch." This isn't just teenage rebellion. This is a calculated power grab using the aggressive tactics she learned behind bars. Meg's transformation becomes clear when she forces Peter to punch himself in the face repeatedly while she watches. Peter, who has spent years bullying and humiliating Meg, finds himself completely powerless against his daughter's new persona. She orders him around like he's her personal servant, demanding beer and making it clear that disobedience will result in physical consequences. The man who once treated Meg as the family's punching bag now cowers in fear of her. The family's entire dynamic gets flipped upside down as Meg establishes prison-style dominance over everyone in the house. She keeps a poop bucket in her room because she's used to having no privacy or dignity in prison, and she uses Peter's shirts as toilet paper just because she can. When family members try to object to her disgusting behavior, she responds with threats and intimidation that immediately shut down any resistance. Meg's new aggressive behavior extends beyond the home when she gets suspended from school for cracking 3 kids' skulls open. She's no longer the victim of bullying, she's become the bully, using violence to solve any problem or conflict. The scared, submissive girl who used to get picked on has been replaced by someone who sees physical aggression as the first and best solution to any situation. The situation escalates when Meg decides to rob a convenience store to get money to leave town. She forces Peter to drive the getaway car, holding him at gunpoint and treating him like a disposable accomplice. Peter, who used to mock and belittle Meg constantly, now follows her orders without question because he's genuinely afraid of what she might do to him. Meg's prison experience teaches her that nobody can be trusted and that showing vulnerability only leads to exploitation. She tells Brian she doesn't need Luke or anyone else anymore, having internalized the prison mentality that emotional connections are weaknesses that can be used against you. The girl who once desperately sought love and acceptance now views all relationships as potential threats to her safety and dominance. The episode demonstrates how the prison system can create more dangerous criminals than it rehabilitates. Meg went in as a naive teenager who made one bad decision, but came out as someone who sees violence as a normal part of daily life. The system that was supposed to teach her about consequences instead taught her that might makes right, and that fear is the most reliable way to control others. Peter's complete submission to Meg represents a complete reversal of their previous relationship dynamic. The man who spent years treating his daughter as worthless now lives in terror of her, following her orders and accepting her abuse without resistance. This shows how quickly power dynamics can shift when someone is willing to use violence and intimidation to get what they want. The storyline reveals how trauma and institutional influence can fundamentally change someone's personality and values. Meg's transformation from victim to aggressor shows how exposure to violence and the survival mentality of prison can override years of socialization and moral development. The sweet, hopeful girl Brian wrote about in his magazine article gets buried under layers of learned aggression and defensive hostility that prison taught her were necessary for survival. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Peter's energy drink disaster, how reckless experimentation nearly killed him. Peter Griffin's obsession with Red Bull energy drinks escalates into creating his own toxic homemade version with kerosene, causing complete kidney failure that threatens his life and forces his best friend Brian to consider the ultimate sacrifice. This episode shows how Peter's impulsive behavior and refusal to accept limits can create life-threatening consequences for himself and those who love him. Peter's dangerous journey begins when he discovers Red Bull during a night out with his friends at the bar. After complaining about being exhausted from lack of sleep, someone offers him the energy drink, which immediately transforms him into a hyperactive maniac. The caffeine and stimulants give Peter an intense rush that he becomes completely addicted to, driving him to stay awake for days and engage in increasingly erratic behavior, like driving to New York on impulse and appearing on game shows. When Lois realizes how dangerously Peter is behaving, she intervenes by pouring out all his Red Bull in the garden. Rather than accepting this reasonable boundary, Peter becomes determined to recreate the experience on his own. He sets up a makeshift laboratory in the basement and starts experimenting with various chemicals and substances, convinced he can engineer his own energy drink that will give him the same manic highs he craves. Peter's homemade concoction becomes increasingly dangerous as he adds toxic chemicals, including kerosene, to the mixture. When Brian tries to warn him that kerosene will destroy his body, Peter dismisses the concern with twisted logic, claiming kerosene is fuel, Red Bull is fuel, kerosene is Red Bull. His addiction to the energy rush has completely overridden his survival instincts and ability to think rationally about the consequences of ingesting industrial chemicals. The inevitable disaster strikes when Peter collapses after drinking his toxic brew. The hospital tests reveal that all the chemicals he consumed have caused complete kidney failure, leaving him dependent on dialysis treatments 3 times a week just to stay alive. For most of the tension, Hartman explains that Peter needs a kidney transplant, but the waiting list could take months, and Peter's condition is too serious to wait that long without finding a compatible donor. The medical crisis puts Peter's entire family in an impossible situation. Lois volunteers to donate one of her kidneys, but tests show she's not a compatible match. The only family member who could potentially save Peter's life is Brian, but because he's a dog with smaller organs, he would need to donate both of his kidneys to give Peter enough kidney function to survive. This means Brian would die to save Peter's life. Brian's willingness to sacrifice himself for Peter represents the ultimate test of their friendship. Despite Peter's reckless behavior being entirely responsible for the crisis, Brian volunteers to give up his life because Peter gave him a home and treated him like family. Brian reasons that as a dog, he only has about 8 years left anyway, while Peter could have another 40 years with the transplant. This decision devastates the family, especially Stewie, who kidnaps Brian to prevent him from going through with the surgery. The emotional weight of Brian's sacrifice forces everyone to confront how Peter's impulsive behavior affects the people who care about him. Stewie's desperate attempt to save Brian by hiding him at a playground shows how Peter's actions create trauma for his entire family. The baby refuses to accept losing Brian and creates an elaborate fantasy about them living together under a slide, demonstrating how Peter's recklessness puts innocent family members in impossible situations. Dr. Hartman's last-minute decision to donate his own kidney saves both Peter and Brian, but the episode makes clear how close Peter came to destroying his best friend's life through his own selfishness. The fact that Peter needed 3 weeks of dialysis treatments and multiple near-death experiences before getting a transplant shows how serious the consequences of his chemical experimentation really were. Peter's kidney failure storyline demonstrates how addiction and impulsive behavior can escalate from seemingly harmless activities into life-threatening crises. His progression from drinking commercial energy drinks to creating toxic chemical mixtures shows how someone can rationalize increasingly dangerous behavior when they're chasing a particular feeling or experience. The episode suggests that Peter's real addiction isn't to caffeine or energy drinks specifically, but to the feeling of being supercharged and unstoppable. The medical emergency forces Peter to confront how his actions affect others, particularly when someone he loves is willing to die for him. Brian's near sacrifice serves as a wake-up call about the real cost of Peter's reckless behavior, showing that his impulses don't just endanger himself, but also put the people who care about him in impossible positions. Peter's staircase nightmare. When home improvement becomes a daily torture chamber, Peter Griffin becomes trapped in an endless cycle of painful falls. After Lois replaces their old rough stairs with new slippery ones, transforming what should have been a simple home improvement into a source of constant physical suffering. This episode turns typical Family Guy slapstick comedy into something genuinely pitiful, as Peter's repeated injuries accumulate into a pattern of genuine distress and helplessness. The crisis begins with what seems like a reasonable home improvement decision when baby Stewie gets a splinter from the old, rough wooden stairs. Lois, being a caring mother, decides the best solution is to replace the dangerous old stairs with brand new ones. The family's house has clearly been deteriorating. Brian mentions that Meg has been pinned under a roof beam for 2 days, suggesting the Griffin home is falling apart in multiple ways. When Stewie injures himself on the splintery stairs, it becomes the final straw that motivates Lois to take action. The replacement stairs initially seem like a logical upgrade from the old, worn-out wooden steps that were causing injuries. Lois has them installed while Peter is away at the drugstore, where he gets distracted trying to figure out whether a Hispanic woman works there or is just another customer. The timing means Peter has no input into the stair replacement and no opportunity to test them out before they become a permanent fixture in the house. The family views this as a straightforward safety improvement that will prevent future accidents. The new stairs prove to be a catastrophic mistake when Peter returns home and immediately takes a devastating fall. The new wood surface is completely slippery, causing Peter to lose his footing and crash down violently. His panicked reaction, "What the hell happened to the stairs? They're all slippery now," reveals how completely unprepared he was for this change. The fall is severe enough that Lois becomes genuinely concerned about whether he's seriously injured, but Peter struggles to understand what went wrong with what should have been an improvement. The pattern of falls becomes relentless and increasingly demoralizing for Peter as the episode progresses. Every time he attempts to use the stairs, he suffers another painful tumble. The falls become a recurring nightmare that dominates his daily existence, turning basic movement through his own home into a dangerous obstacle course. Each incident becomes more frustrating than the last, as Peter realizes he's trapped in his own house by stairs that seem designed to hurt him. Peter's psychological state deteriorates as the constant falls take their toll on both his body and his confidence. After multiple crashes, he tells his family, "Nothing about this is okay," when they suggest he just needs to be more careful. The repeated injuries create a state of chronic stress and anxiety about something as basic as walking upstairs in his own home. Peter becomes so traumatized by the experience that he eventually decides to abandon the upstairs entirely, creating a makeshift living space in what appears to be an upper room. The situation reaches its absurd peak when Peter constructs an elaborate nest out of his old underwear, declaring he will lay his eggs and raise his young in this room alone. This bizarre behavior represents Peter's complete psychological breakdown in response to the stair situation. He's so afraid of falling again that he's willing to live like an animal rather than risk another trip down the deadly stairs. His attempt to rig some kind of pulley system to avoid using the stairs backfires spectacularly, causing another injury that demonstrates how desperate he's become. Peter's isolation upstairs becomes a form of self-imposed exile from his own family. The man who usually dominates family conversations and activities finds himself literally separated from the rest of the household by his fear of the stairs. This physical separation creates emotional distance as well, as Peter becomes increasingly detached from normal family life. His bizarre behavior suggests he's having some kind of psychological break brought on by the constant physical trauma and stress. The episode transforms typical Peter Griffin slapstick into something genuinely uncomfortable to watch. Usually, Peter's physical comedy involves him bouncing back immediately from ridiculous injuries, but the stair falls accumulate into real suffering. Each fall becomes less funny and more concerning as it becomes clear that Peter is genuinely afraid and in pain. The repetitive nature of the accidents strips away the humor and reveals the genuine helplessness of someone trapped in an unsafe living situation. The stair situation highlights how quickly a well-intentioned home improvement can backfire and create new problems worse than the original issue. Lois's decision to replace rough stairs with smooth ones solves the splinter problem but creates a slipping hazard that proves far more dangerous. The episode suggests that sometimes the cure can be worse than the disease, especially when safety improvements aren't properly planned or tested. Peter's response to the crisis also reveals his inability to adapt to change or find practical solutions to problems. Rather than addressing the slippery surface with non-slip strips, better shoes, or handrails, Peter retreats into increasingly bizarre avoidance behaviors. His decision to live upstairs permanently rather than fix the actual problem shows his tendency to create elaborate workarounds instead of dealing with issues directly. The episode ultimately demonstrates how environmental hazards in the home can completely disrupt normal life and psychological well-being. Peter's transformation from confident family patriarch to scared, isolated hermit shows how repeated accidents can erode someone's sense of safety and control in their own living space. The stairs become a symbol of how quickly familiar spaces can become threatening when safety measures go wrong. By the end of the episode, when Lois finally has the old stairs restored, Peter's relief is palpable. The return to the familiar, rough stairs that might cause splinters seems infinitely preferable to the smooth stairs that guarantee falls. The resolution suggests that sometimes older, imperfect solutions are better than newer improvements that create unforeseen problems, and that home safety requires careful consideration of all potential consequences rather than quick fixes that might backfire. Peter's wilderness nightmare: how a strip club trip turned him into a savage. Peter Griffin becomes completely feral after spending 2 months alone in the Canadian wilderness following a plane crash, losing all ability to speak and behave like a civilized human being. This episode shows how quickly isolation and survival instincts can strip away years of socialization, turning Peter from a bumbling family man into a primitive creature who can barely recognize his own family. The disaster begins with what should have been a fun weekend trip when Quagmire invites Peter, Joe, and Brian to visit Montreal's famous strip clubs. Quagmire arranges a private plane for the journey, complete with luxury amenities and even a bathroom map that lets passengers choose where to dump waste. The men are excited about their adventure and lie to their wives about the true purpose of their trip, with Peter telling Lois they're going for some vague business purpose while she's distracted by other household issues. Peter's reckless behavior during the flight directly causes the plane crash that strands them all in the wilderness. When he claims to see a man on the wing, his friends dismiss it as paranoia, but Peter becomes so agitated that he actually goes outside onto the wing during flight. This insane stunt causes the plane to lose altitude and crash in the remote Canadian forest, leaving all 4 men stranded with no way to contact civilization and no survival supplies. The immediate survival situation becomes dire as the group faces the harsh realities of wilderness, living without preparation or proper equipment. They have no food, no clean water, and no shelter beyond what they can construct from plane wreckage and forest materials. Quagmire tries to take charge by setting up basic survival protocols like building fires and creating traps for food, but their urban lifestyles have left them completely unprepared for this level of self-sufficiency. Joe's situation becomes even worse when he accidentally triggers one of their own traps, breaking both his legs and leaving him completely immobilized. The group's rescue hopes fade when they realize nobody knows their true destination, since they lied about the trip. After several days of failed survival attempts and growing desperation, they reach the painful conclusion that someone needs to venture into the unknown wilderness to find help. Since Peter is the only one still mobile after Joe's injury, he volunteers to walk through the forest until he reaches civilization, despite having no navigation skills or wilderness experience. Peter's solo journey into the vast Canadian wilderness becomes a nightmare of isolation and survival that fundamentally changes his psychological makeup. With no human contact for 2 months, he's forced to live like a wild animal, foraging for food, building primitive shelters, and defending himself against actual wildlife. The complete absence of human interaction and the constant stress of survival gradually erode his capacity for speech, social behavior, and even basic recognition of civilized concepts. When search teams finally locate Peter after 2 months, they discover he's become completely feral, unable to speak beyond grunts and growls, eating garbage, throwing bodily fluids, and showing no recognition of human social norms. The man who once dominated family conversations with his loud opinions and stories has been reduced to a primitive creature who communicates only through animal-like behaviors. His transformation is so complete that he doesn't even recognize his own family when they're reunited. The psychological damage from Peter's wilderness ordeal proves resistant to conventional rehabilitation efforts. His family tries multiple approaches to restore his humanity, including showing him familiar objects like the television, playing music he used to enjoy, and even using pre-recorded videos that Peter had ironically made in case he ever became feral. Despite these attempts, Peter remains trapped in his primitive state, unable to access the speech patterns and social behaviors that once defined his personality. Peter's feral condition creates an impossible situation for his family, who must choose between continuing futile rehabilitation attempts or accepting that the man they knew may be permanently lost. The emotional toll becomes unbearable as they watch someone they love reduced to a wild creature who can't even recognize them as family members. Lois faces the heartbreaking possibility that her husband may need to be released back into the wild, where he seems more comfortable than in human society. The family's decision to release Peter back into the forest represents their acceptance that 2 months of isolation has fundamentally broken something in his psyche that may never be repaired. The scene becomes deeply tragic as they say goodbye to someone who's physically present but psychologically unreachable, essentially mourning a person who's still alive, but no longer accessible to them as a conscious human being. Peter's miraculous recovery happens when Meg expresses genuine love and acceptance despite his condition, somehow breaking through the psychological barriers that trauma and isolation had created. Her declaration that he'll always be her father triggers his first human speech in months, ironically, telling her to shut up, which represents a return to his familiar personality patterns. This breakthrough suggests that emotional connection and unconditional acceptance were more powerful rehabilitation tools than any technical intervention. The episode demonstrates how quickly extreme isolation can unravel years of socialization and psychological development. Peter's transformation from a verbose social creature into a grunting primitive shows how dependent human consciousness is on continuous social interaction and cultural reinforcement. Without other people to interact with, even basic language skills atrophy as survival instincts override higher cognitive functions. Peter's experience also reveals the psychological fragility hidden beneath his usually confident exterior. The man who typically bounces back from ridiculous situations with his ego intact becomes completely broken by genuine hardship and isolation. This suggests that his normal resilience depends heavily on social support systems and familiar environments that weren't available in the wilderness survival situation. The wilderness ordeal strips away all of Peter's usual coping mechanisms and social roles, revealing the vulnerable person underneath his loud, obnoxious persona. Without his job, his family dynamics, his friends, and his routine activities to define him, Peter loses his sense of identity entirely and reverts to pure survival mode. The episode suggests that personality itself is more fragile than we typically assume, requiring constant social reinforcement to maintain its coherence and complexity. Peter's social nightmare, how illness made him invisible to his own friends. Peter Griffin becomes consumed with fear and jealousy when his illness forces Lois to take his place in his bowling team, only to discover that his friends prefer her company and humor to his own. This episode exposes Peter's deep insecurity about his social value and his terror of being replaced in the relationships that define his identity as a man. The crisis begins when Peter develops a severe illness that gives him an incredibly deep, sexy voice that initially thrills Lois, but leaves him physically debilitated. Peter's desperate attempts to maintain his newfound sexual appeal lead him to deliberately make himself sicker, ignoring his deteriorating health in favor of keeping Lois attracted to him. When he finally recovers, he loses both the sexy voice and discovers he's too sick to participate in an important bowling tournament with Joe and Quagmire, the kind of male bonding activity that forms the core of his social identity. Peter's request for Lois to substitute for him in the bowling tournament seems like a simple favor between spouses, but it opens the door to his worst nightmare about male friendship and social hierarchy. Peter assumes Lois will be a temporary, inadequate replacement who will make his friends appreciate his return even more. He has no concept that his wife might actually be good at bowling, or, more threateningly, that she might be more entertaining company than he is. The invitation represents Peter's first major miscalculation about his own irreplaceable value to his friend group. Lois's immediate success with Joe and Quagmire shatters Peter's assumptions about his social position and reveals how tenuous his friendships really are. She proves to be not only a skilled bowler who helps them win the tournament, but also a gifted storyteller who entertains them with anecdotes about trapeze performers and circus people. The men are delighted by her company and begin including her in activities that extend far beyond the original bowling favor, going to baseball games, visiting bars, and sharing the kind of casual male camaraderie that Peter thought belonged exclusively to him. Peter's growing panic as he watches his replacement unfold becomes the emotional core of his suffering. When he recovers from his illness and tries to rejoin the group, he discovers that Joe and Quagmire now have nicknames from Lois, Quags, and Swanee, inside jokes he doesn't understand, and a dynamic that no longer requires his presence. His attempts to reclaim his position by telling his own stories fall completely flat. His anecdote about a man choking on an almond and having a stroke horrifies rather than entertains his friends, highlighting how his humor has always been crude and insensitive compared to Lois's more sophisticated wit. The depth of Peter's insecurity becomes clear when he desperately tries to assert his territorial rights over his friendships, telling Lois that Joe and Quagmire are all he's got and demanding she stick to groceries and rusty pink razors. This outburst reveals how much of Peter's self-worth depends on being the center of attention in his small social circle, and how threatened he feels by anyone who might prove more valuable to his friends than he is. His claim that he has difficulty making new friends exposes the underlying vulnerability beneath his typically confident exterior. Peter's emotional breakdown during a subsequent bar visit shows how completely the situation has destabilized his sense of self. When his friends continue to focus on Lois's entertaining stories while dismissing his contributions, Peter becomes increasingly frantic and disoriented, even mixing up his friends' names. His desperate plea of, "Please look at me," reveals someone whose entire identity depends on being the focal point of social interactions, and who cannot cope with being relegated to a secondary role in his own friend group. The crisis forces Peter to confront the uncomfortable reality that his friendships may have been based more on habit and convenience than on genuine appreciation for his personality or companionship. Lois's easy integration into the group suggests that Peter's role was not as irreplaceable as he believed, and that his friends were perhaps tolerating rather than truly enjoying his company. This realization strikes at the heart of Peter's masculine identity, which is built around being the dominant, entertaining figure in any social situation. Peter's fear of social irrelevance reflects deeper anxieties about aging, changing relationships, and the possibility that the people closest to him might actually prefer life without him. The episode taps into the universal fear that we might not be as important to others as they are to us, and that our absence might be more of a relief than a loss. For someone like Peter, whose self-esteem depends heavily on external validation and social dominance, this possibility represents an existential threat. The resolution comes when Lois voluntarily steps back from the friendships, recognizing that Peter's need for these relationships outweighs her own enjoyment of them. Her decision to prioritize her marriage over her new friendships demonstrates emotional maturity and sacrifice, but it also highlights how fragile Peter's ego really is. The fact that he cannot handle sharing these friendships or competing for attention reveals significant insecurity beneath his usually boisterous confidence. Lois's graceful exit from the friend group, complete with deliberately off-putting comments about periods and feminine hygiene, shows her understanding that Peter's social needs are more desperate than her own. Her willingness to make herself seem boring and gross, to preserve Peter's masculine pride, reveals both her love for him and her recognition of how much his identity depends on these friendships. The episode suggests that sometimes maintaining relationships requires one person to sacrifice their own social opportunities for their partner's psychological well-being. The episode ultimately exposes how much of male friendship can be built on performance and competition, rather than genuine emotional connection. Peter's terror of being replaced suggests that his relationships with Joe and Quagmire are more about maintaining his position in a social hierarchy than about deep personal bonds. The ease with which Lois slides into his role indicates that the group dynamic was never really about Peter's unique qualities, but rather about having someone to fill a particular social function that could be performed by almost anyone with basic social skills and a sense of humor. Peter's devastating loss, how Brian's death shattered his world. Peter Griffin experiences the most profound grief of his life when Brian dies in a freak street hockey accident, revealing the depth of their unlikely friendship and forcing Peter to confront what it means to lose someone who truly understood him. This episode strips away all of Peter's usual comedic resilience and shows him genuinely broken by the loss of the one relationship that defined his emotional core. The tragedy begins on what should have been an ordinary day of outdoor recreation when Stewie decides to destroy his time machine and suggests he and Brian take up street hockey as a new hobby. After finding a perfectly good hockey net at the dump, they set it up in the street for some casual exercise and fresh air. Activity represents a rare moment of simple, healthy fun for both characters. Brian taking a break from his usual intellectual pursuits, and Stewie exploring normal childhood activities rather than his typical world domination schemes. The accident happens with shocking suddenness when Brian goes to retrieve his knee pads and a speeding car strikes him while he's positioned near the hockey net. The driver doesn't even stop to check on Brian, leaving Stewie alone to witness his best friend's devastating injuries. The scene becomes immediately tragic as Brian lies broken in the street, his injuries so severe that even the veterinarian cannot save him. What started as innocent fun transforms into an unthinkable nightmare in a matter of seconds. Brian's death scene becomes one of the most emotionally devastating moments in the series, as he uses his final breaths to tell his family how much they've meant to him. His last words, "You've given me a wonderful life. I love you all," capture the gratitude and love that defined his relationship with the Griffin family. Peter's immediate reaction shows complete devastation as he frantically tells Brian about all the things they were supposed to do together, including becoming windsurfers, where Peter would be a little better, but they'd both be good. This reveals Peter's deep affection, mixed with his typical competitive nature, showing how their friendship encompassed both genuine love and Peter's need to feel superior. The funeral scene exposes the full extent of Peter's emotional breakdown as he struggles to articulate what Brian meant to him in front of the gathered mourners. His comparison of the pain to spraining his ankle twice initially seems like typical Peter insensitivity, but it actually represents his attempt to quantify emotional pain in the only terms he understands. When he calls Brian his best friend in the whole world and says he was like a brother, Peter reveals the depth of a relationship that transcended the typical pet owner dynamic and became something genuinely meaningful. Peter's grief manifests in ways that show how thoroughly Brian's loss has disrupted his daily existence. A month after the death, Peter still automatically serves Brian dinner before catching himself, indicating how deeply ingrained their routines had become. His comment about this being the worst pain I've ever had to go through, and that he'll spend the rest of my life missing him, shows a level of emotional honesty rarely seen from Peter, who usually deflects serious feelings with humor or bluster. The suggestion to get a new dog creates internal conflict for Peter between his practical need to move forward and his loyalty to Brian's memory. While Lois suggests that finding a new pet might help the family heal, Peter approaches this decision with uncharacteristic thoughtfulness. His willingness to even consider replacing Brian shows how much the loss has affected his daily life, while his careful approach to choosing Vinny indicates his awareness that no dog could truly replace what he had with Brian. Peter's interaction with Vinny reveals how he's trying to rebuild the companionship he lost while recognizing that this new relationship will be fundamentally different. When Vinny offers to cook dinner and shows immediate consideration for Lois, Peter seems genuinely impressed by qualities that Brian never possessed. However, his enthusiastic, "all right," when Vinny claims to be a pussy hound, shows Peter trying to recapture the male bonding aspects of his relationship with Brian. suggesting he's looking for specific emotional needs to be fulfilled. The episode demonstrates how Brian's death affects Peter's entire worldview about relationships and loyalty. Brian represented intellectual stimulation, emotional support, and non-judgmental companionship that Peter couldn't find elsewhere in his life. Unlike his human friends who often mock or dismiss him, Brian genuinely cared about Peter's well-being and offered sophisticated conversation that challenged Peter to think beyond his usual simplistic perspectives. Peter's grief also reveals his capacity for genuine love beneath his typically selfish exterior. His description of Brian as someone who was smart and loyal shows that Peter actually valued Brian's better qualities rather than just seeing him as entertainment or an ego boost. The fact that Peter considers this loss worse than any physical pain he's experienced indicates his ability to form deep emotional attachments, despite his usual focus on immediate gratification and surface-level concerns. The process of accepting Vinny into the family forces Peter to confront what made his relationship with Brian special, while remaining open to new forms of companionship. Vinny's working-class personality and practical skills represent a different kind of friendship than Brian's intellectual approach, but one that might actually complement Peter's personality better in some ways. This suggests that Peter's mourning process involves both honoring his past relationship and remaining open to different but equally meaningful connections. Peter's experience with grief ultimately reveals emotional depths that his usual buffoonish behavior typically conceals. The loss of Brian strips away his defensive humor and forces him to articulate genuine feelings about love, friendship, and loss. His funeral speech, despite its awkward beginning, becomes a surprisingly moving tribute that shows Peter's capacity for sincere emotion when circumstances demand it. The episode suggests that beneath Peter's obnoxious exterior lies someone capable of forming profound bonds and experiencing genuine heartbreak when those connections are severed. The long-term impact of Brian's death continues to shape Peter's behavior and relationships throughout the episode, showing how significant loss can fundamentally alter someone's approach to life and connection. His willingness to welcome Vinny while still honoring Brian's memory demonstrates emotional growth and the complex process of healing while maintaining loyalty to important relationships that have ended. Peter's dual crisis. How job loss and impotence destroyed his masculine identity. Peter Griffin suffers a complete psychological breakdown when losing his forklift operator job triggers severe erectile dysfunction, creating a vicious cycle where unemployment destroys his sexual confidence and impotence reinforces his sense of worthlessness as a man. This episode explores how traditional masculine identity depends on both professional success and sexual performance, and how the loss of either can devastate a man's entire sense of self-worth. The crisis begins when Peter receives a promotion to forklift operator, which initially fills him with pride and excitement about his new status at work. The job comes with a 5% raise and the respect that comes with operating heavy machinery, making Peter feel more important and capable than he has in years. He revels in the power and freedom the forklift gives him, using it to show off for his friends and feel superior to pedestrians who can't see his elevated position. The forklift becomes a symbol of his masculine competence and workplace authority. Peter's reckless behavior with the forklift sets up the inevitable disaster that will strip away his newfound confidence. His decision to drive the forklift into a conference room during a sales presentation, injuring 2 people and causing significant property damage, represents the kind of impulsive, thoughtless action that has defined his character throughout the series. However, this time, the consequences extend far beyond temporary embarrassment. His boss fires him immediately for gross negligence, taking away both his income and his sense of professional identity. The job loss creates immediate financial pressure that forces a complete restructuring of the Griffin household dynamics. With their savings running low and bills piling up, Lois has no choice but to seek employment at the local grocery store, becoming the family's primary breadwinner for the first time in their marriage. Peter finds himself relegated to the role of house husband, responsible for cooking, cleaning, laundry, and childcare. Tasks he's never performed and views as fundamentally feminine in nature. Peter's struggle with domestic responsibilities reveals how unprepared he is for anything outside traditional masculine roles. His attempts at cooking result in serving the family raw Cornish game hens, while his laundry efforts involve using the dishwasher when the washing machine acts up. His discomfort with changing Stewie's diaper becomes so extreme that he narrates the entire process to avoid any suggestion of impropriety, highlighting his anxiety about performing tasks he considers women's work. The complete reversal of traditional gender roles in the Griffin household creates psychological pressure that manifests as erectile dysfunction, creating a physical symbol of Peter's lost masculinity. When Lois returns from work seeking sexual intimacy, Peter finds himself unable to perform, telling her his hog cannot partake in the slop this evening. The euphemistic language reveals his embarrassment about discussing the problem directly, while the timing makes clear the connection between his lost professional identity and his sexual dysfunction. Peter's impotence becomes a source of public humiliation when he confesses to Joe and Quagmire that he lied about having an erection earlier in the evening. His desperate plea of, "Please don't make me go home and disappoint my wife yet again," shows how the sexual dysfunction has become a daily source of shame that reinforces his feelings of inadequacy as a husband. Even his friends recognize the seriousness of the situation, with Quagmire offering increasingly elaborate solutions to restore Peter's sexual function. The medical consultation with Dr. Hartman provides no real help, as the doctor suggests divorce as a solution and admits he's been prescribing erectile dysfunction medications as antidepressants. This incompetence forces Peter to rely on his friends for support, leading to increasingly desperate and humiliating attempts to restore his sexual function through mechanical aids and psychological manipulation. Quagmire's sex puppet contraption represents the depths to which Peter's desperation has driven him. Peter's emotional breakdown reveals how much his identity depends on external validation and traditional masculine markers of success. His inability to provide for his family financially or satisfy his wife sexually strips away the two primary ways he defines his worth as a man. The episode shows how fragile masculine identity can be when it's built entirely on performance, rather than intrinsic self-worth or emotional intelligence. The connection between employment and sexual function becomes explicit when Quagmire identifies Peter's job loss as the root cause of his impotence, explaining that he's been completely emasculated because you're no longer the breadwinner. This diagnosis suggests that Peter's sexual dysfunction is psychological rather than physical, stemming from his inability to fulfill the traditional male role of financial provider. The episode implies that masculine identity is so tied to professional success that unemployment can literally render a man impotent. Peter's desperate attempt to regain his job involves cashing in a Valentine's Day coupon from his boss that promises one redo for being fired for gross negligence. This absurd solution highlights both Peter's lack of conventional problem-solving skills and his recognition that employment is essential to his psychological well-being. The fact that such a coupon exists suggests his boss anticipated Peter's inevitable failure, making his rehiring both predictable and somewhat pathetic. The immediate restoration of Peter's sexual function upon regaining employment confirms the psychological nature of his dysfunction and the direct connection between his professional and sexual identity. His suggestion that he and Lois have sex right here on a stack of pita bread in the grocery store represents an aggressive reassertion of his masculine dominance and sexual confidence. The crude nature of this suggestion shows Peter overcompensating for his period of dysfunction by being aggressively sexual. The episode reveals how traditional gender roles can create psychological pressure that manifests in physical symptoms when those roles are threatened or reversed. Peter's complete inability to adapt to domestic responsibilities or accept his wife as the primary breadwinner suggests a rigidity in masculine identity that makes men vulnerable to crisis when circumstances change. His recovery depends entirely on restoring traditional arrangements rather than developing new ways of defining masculine worth. The storyline demonstrates how unemployment can affect every aspect of a man's life when his identity is built around traditional masculine roles. Peter's job loss doesn't just create financial problems. It triggers a cascade of psychological issues that affect his marriage, his self-esteem, and even his physical health. The episode suggests that men who tie their worth entirely to professional success and sexual performance are extremely vulnerable to complete psychological breakdown when either element is threatened. The resolution, while providing immediate relief for Peter, does little to address the underlying fragility of his masculine identity or develop alternative sources of self-worth that might be more resilient to future setbacks. His return to the forklift operator position restores his confidence, but leaves him just as vulnerable to future crises as before, suggesting that his recovery is temporary rather than transformative. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video about the darkest Family Guy episodes.